And it's now my great good fortune to introduce Peggy Smith. Dr. Smith is the Harold W. Tribble Professor of Art Emerita at Wake Forest University, where she was also chair of the art department. She was invited to teach at Wake Forest in 1979, visited on a warm April day, and the first house she saw was Reynolda. I think she said that she thought every day was like this in Winston-Salem, that every house was like Reynolda. As I mentioned earlier, the stunning green tile roof and the white stucco facade put her in mind of the suburban areas in Philadelphia that she knew as a child. After all, architect Charles Barton Keene and landscape architect Thomas Sears were Philadelphians. Together, they contributed in untold ways to many designs in our city. The architectural history of Winston-Salem is in part a Philadelphia story, which it may have taken a Philadelphian to tell. Your great humility notwithstanding, Peggy, we are going to talk about you for a minute. Because we're honored to know Peggy Smith. We're honored to have today a preview of her book, which is due out next year to be published by Preservation North Carolina. Peggy has reminded us again and again that architecture is the one art form that each of us encounters at some point in everyday life. Her articles and books help us to uncover the stories that architecture tells about our history. Peggy has been researching Winston-Salem's development through architecture and the great houses built by its leaders. Part of her work, of course, revolves around Reynolda and its architect, Charles Barton Keene. Peggy was the first scholar to situate this country house in the context of a national movement that began with the Biltmore and extended into the 1930s. In 1981, Peggy curated an exhibition of photographs that placed Reynolda in the country place era. And a few years later, she published an article about Catherine Smith Reynolds as a reformer with a vision of upgrading rural life in the Piedmont region. And it's worth noting that this is the very period at Wake Forest when women's studies were being embraced. The insights of women's studies as a discipline shaped Reynolda's story in new ways, and a focus on R.J. Reynolds came to embrace also his young wife and her progressive vision of agricultural and educational reform. The feminine name Reynolda took on new and deeper meanings. To emphasize my point, Peggy was one of the founders of women's studies at Wake Forest University, and it was Peggy Smith who restored Catherine's image as one of Winston-Salem's great leaders and builders. It's the privilege of the present to be complacent and condescending toward the past, and every fascinating story gets forgotten and needs to be rediscovered and dusted off. King's Tut tomb had its Howard Carter, the Rosetta Stone had its Champollion, and Catherine Reynolds' idealistic project of Reynolda had its Peggy Smith. Her recent work will accomplish the same unearthing of stories of other influential people in Winston-Salem history. Peggy is author of North Carolina Women Making History, co-written with her friend and colleague Emily Herring Wilson. Their book won the Mayflower Society Award for Nonfiction, and there was a companion exhibition of North Carolina women making history at the Museum of History in Raleigh. Peggy's book, The American Ski Resort, Architecture, Style, and Experience, came out in a beautiful edition in 2013. Whether it's ski resorts, grand rural edifices, or suburban neighborhoods, Peggy helps us see how Americans, and often women, chose to express their times and their aspirations through architecture. This art form that we encounter every single day has so often brought people together at Reynolda. I'm happy that you've gathered with us today to enjoy Peggy Smith. Peggy, you're the consummate teacher. Winston-Salem is fortunate that you and Jackson have called it home. Please join me in welcoming Peggy Smith to the stage.
Well, I'm not sure that I can top the introduction, but I didn't hear Phil say that I founded Wake Forest University, did I? Because that would not be true. But thinking about speaking to you all today, and let me just say, I don't see one person in the room. So you don't have to smile to urge me to keep on going. But what this reminds me of, because my talk is part of a 3-part series with Richard Guy Wilson, Mark Hewitt, and me. And if Nick Bragg were here, he would say, that's two swells and a local. And so I want you to realize that I am representing the local. And the lecture or the talk that I've put together, I think you can just walk right out of here and you will walk past all of the houses that we look at. In other words, they're it's going to be very familiar to you. Okay. My research projects have always been personal as well as academic. My doctoral dissertation was on America's largest Victorian urban neighborhood, 3,700 row houses, and that's where my family lived in the 1970s. I could walk to the houses I was studying, and my husband could walk to take the photographs of those houses. So in the days when I was an administrator, I was known as an administrator of proximity, and that's going to be what I'm presenting to you tonight. Wait 1 minute. Okay, I just wanted to look at the time because when we moved to North Carolina and I began teaching at Wake Forest, I could pop through the woods to research Winston-Salem's premier country estate. Having made such a major move, I was disconcerted to discover that North Carolina had not ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, and apparently did not intend to. In 1987, the state made me an offer I couldn't refuse, to head up the Women's History Project and to focus attention on the state's women. That resulted in a major exhibition that opened the new State History Museum and this book written by Emily Herring Wilson and me. We drove to all 100 counties in North Carolina, and that was the beginning of a long friendship. We are grateful that the book is still in print, and if you have any granddaughters or nieces, it is still there for them. After 12 years in women's history, I really needed a break from women. And it was heartfelt, but I just needed a break. And reclaimed my earlier interest and training in architectural history. And of course, getting to do it with ski resorts was a very interesting project. That took 13 years of airplane travel and research. It survived the Great Recession and was published after I had retired from Wake Forest. Meanwhile, the great houses lining Stratford Road, Virginia Avenue, Buena Vista Road, and other neighborhoods that have presented a picture book view of Winston-Salem since the 1920s were in my backyard. In 2012, Catherine Hendren, at that time president of Preserve Historic Forsyth, and Greg Hunter proposed that I write a book on Winston-Salem's great houses. Preservation North Carolina signed on as the project sponsor, and Sandra Boyette joined the local committee. These suburban houses became part of my routine. I could walk over, study them, I could see if any changes had happened, and for several years wrote articles on them in the Buena Vista Life magazine, whose editor is sitting over there, I think, unless he's left. No, I know you didn't. First, let me show you the great houses we will not be discussing. These are houses that are mostly open to the public. They're familiar to you, and really they're historic preservation is assured because an institution is taking care of them. But certainly we have to start with Reynolda, which I consider the mothership of Winston-Salem's suburban architecture. And I'll just go back and have you notice again that green roof, because that's terrifically important. The estate of Will Reynolds and Kate Bidding out in Tanglewood, which is now a wonderful county park. I think we're very lucky. Let me just ask you, can you read those titles? Yes. Good. And Grayland, across the street, a little bit more fancy than the two Reynolds properties. And then Chatham Farm, which doesn't fall into this category of having a house and the landscape, but was a farm that Hugh Chatham established to teach his grandchildren about farming. And as he was getting older, two children took it over. And so one, you've got the Ralph Haynes house, which is built there, and then the Molly and James G. Haynes house across the way. So we know those houses exist, we visited them, we think they're wonderful, and indeed they really are wonderful. The country estates were large houses with extensive grounds built for entertaining as well as for family, competitive gentleman farming, and Phil Archer is working on that topic. They brought upper class recreation like golf and tennis and polo to Winston-Salem. 5 of the 6 estates in my book were for presidents of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. 3 are on the Yadkin River, and I consider that our Long Island Sound. And I just want to give a shout out, because when I first started this project, Tom Gray took me to all those estates, all those farms out there, and really introduced them to me in a wonderful way. The high standards in the architecture and the landscape of the estates provided models for the suburban houses. And this is where we're going. Oh, okay. Can you see that diagram? Yeah. Okay. Well, look at it. Wait a minute. What we're focusing on is I don't think I'm going to use that too often. You find it yourselves. What we're working on is the suburban area between the country house area and then downtown. And if you think about the way Winston-Salem started, Reynolda was like a spear out here, establishing this point and then filling in between Reynolda and downtown is where the Buena Vista neighborhood is. The Winston-Salem industrialists formerly lived close to the factories downtown. This is elevated land, and one of the things that I've learned from working on this project is just how hilly Winston-Salem is. And maybe you all realized it, but I didn't. And really the best houses are on the highest site. So keep that in mind as you're riding around. Because Winston was prospering so much with camels and Prince Albert and textiles, Downtown was a less felicitous urban environment, and at the same time, the industry provided money to build in the country. Plus, automobiles are coming in at this time, so you've got a means to get out here. Winston-Salem's suburban neighborhoods, from Ardmore to Buena Vista to Country Club, are a visual index of the prosperity brought by textile and tobacco industries in the 1920s. Stratford Road, Georgia, Virginia, Runnymede, Club Park are lined with houses of tobacco folk. Winston-Salem became a magnet for ambitious and talented farm boys, many of whom knew leaf and hard work and became leaders in the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. There are some textile workers that are in the neighborhoods we're looking at, but that is a different story, and we're not doing that today. R.J. Reynolds' decision to keep the tobacco company manufacturing, finances, sales, advertising, and marketing local, and significantly the stock, which you know, but the managerial class, all those people who were moving through the ranks, had a major impact on the character and the extent of the suburban neighborhoods. There was a good deal of money that could be spent on housing. James Buchanan Duke kept his manufacturing in North Carolina, but he moved the high-level executives and administrative operations to New York. R.J. Reynolds did not do that, and the legacy of his decision is what distinguishes Winston-Salem today, that we have all these really wonderful suburban neighborhoods. And just looking at that, all of the people who built those houses grew up in modest farming households and got to build a house on Buena Vista and Club Park Road. And now, you all are probably familiar with the 1931 Fortune magazine article on Winston-Salem and the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. In that article, they mention 5 families: the Reynolds, the Grays, the Haynes, the Chathams, and the Freeds. All of those 5 families were engaged in real estate development in Winston-Salem. And I have to be honest and say there's times when I wonder, did they make their money in real estate rather than in industry? Because believe me, they are everywhere when we look at these neighborhoods. But today we're looking at 2 suburban neighborhoods, or 4 suburban neighborhoods developed by the Reynolds and the Haynes family. Indicative of the era, all 4 were restricted neighborhoods in that blacks could only live there as servants in a household. And the census indicates that quite a few did, including married couples in which the women were cooks and maids, the men were yardmen and chauffeurs. And becoming a chauffeur was a new occupation created by the advent of automobiles and the ubiquitousness of automobiles. And you see all the people who did all this hard work that I have used on the screen. Many of them are in this room, so let's give them a shout out. Thank you. The first one we'll look at is Reynolda Park, which is pretty handy for us right now. Here's Ruth Smith at a 1923 garden party to launch the architect Catherine was introducing to Winston-Salem, Charles Barton Keene, her minister, who she had convinced, I believe, to come here, and also Reynolda Park. It was an auspicious launch for what was destined to be Winston-Salem's most exclusive early 20th century suburb. And on the screen is an aerial view of 1927. And let me try to... Reynolda Road. Wait a minute. Reynolda Road you get. Reynolda Park. And facing Reynolda Road are 3 houses designed by Charles Barton King. One for Catherine Smith Reynolds Johnson's new mother-in-law, Lola Johnston. Another for her niece, Sina Kreitz Kent, and then Richard Stockton. So they're facing Reynolda. And across Reynolda, you see the site for Grayland. And this is a map that was done after Catherine Reynolds died in childbirth in 1924. I should say she started plans for Reynolda Park in 1923, and then she died in 1924, so really there wasn't much time to get it started. After that, all of her holdings were surveyed, and that's what you're looking at. This is what was in her estate, and you can see Reynolda, the 5 Rows community, Grayland has been built, and then Reynolda Park with its curvilinear streets. And something I learned when Chris Jordan presented the LRB inventory, as it's called, was that Barbara Milhouse's father bought the land where Wake Forest College came to. If you look at that map, you'll see that really Reynolda did not include much of what the campus is. The design for Reynolda Park was by Reynolda's landscape architect, Thomas Sears. And there were 16 original houses. You have curving streets that contrast with the grid of Winston-Salem. It's a park, Reynolda Park. Dense landscaping providing naturalistic setting. The houses set back from the road to ensure privacy. And Sears even suggested treatments for the houses and the garden as part of the original plan. Now, what I did, this was being creative with PowerPoint, was take these different themes and superimpose the houses on Thomas Sears' plan. And so I was looking, we always hear Reynolda was home to Reynolds kin. Well, indeed, it is. And here are the houses. There were 2 nieces and a mother-in-law in the 1920s, and then a grandniece and a son in the 1930s. And here's Sina Kent, who was married at Reynolda and a niece of R.J. Reynolds, and Kent Graham, who was the daughter of Cece Hill and Nancy O'Hanlon, who was also in the Kreitz family, Hill. And this, I think, was the first debutante ball in Winston-Salem. There's also really a large number of tobacco legacy families. And what these are the families that moved to Winston-Salem in the 1870s, set up manufacturing, tobacco manufacturing, and really prospered. These are their children who moved to Reynolda Park. And so it's the younger generation of the tobacco oligarchy. They grew up on Spring Street and Fifth Street, and then when they married, they moved to Reynolda Park. Their uncles and their fathers had served in the Civil War and were on the ground floor of what became national brands in tobacco. The women were active in the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The men were in the Sons of the Confederacy at a time when Winston-Salem celebrated Confederate Memorial Day every May with picnics, parades, and speeches. So you can see just how many families there are: the Barbers, the Browns, the Cohens, the Hills, the Norfleets, the Reynolds, Taylor, and Whitaker. And here's two photographs of those children. George Whitaker, who is the younger brother of John Whitaker and his son, and George Whitaker unfortunately died of a brain tumor at a very early age. And then on the other screen is May Cone Montcastle and her family. And her brother lived next door to her. The homeowners are here, that's great. Her brother lived next door to her and was the mayor of Winston-Salem. There's also, we're still in Reynolda Park, tobacco company executives who were born on a farm and rose through the ranks and then achieved enough status and income to build in Reynolda Park. The top house, the Owen, and who was the traffic manager, Lewis Owen, J.B. Dyer, who headed the Leaf department, and then on the bottom, Secretary Madison Motzinger, who not only rose through the ranks, but he also was married to Myrtle Chatham of the Blanket Company. Owning a great house in Reynolda Park was a marker of their success. And the houses of the legacy families and the Reynolds kin tend to be younger people, and these tend to be older. They were well into their 50s when they moved there. And then siblings. It was a pretty tight community with Emery and May Barker and Nancy and Sina, Nancy O'Hanlon and Sina Kent, and Richard and Norman Stockton. And Norman Stockton was married to Emery Barber, so you had sort of double siblings there. And then George and May Cone. I feel like I should stop and say, does anyone have any questions? When we look at Reynolda Park with the architectural styles, the three houses that were built for Reynolds kin all reflect Reynolda House. You're looking right there at the house built for Lola Johnson, who was Catherine Reynolds' mother-in-law, briefly. And that's the house on the corner. It was closest to Reynolda. And I really think that Catherine Reynolds saw that house as a fulcrum, her new family, between the Reynolda estate and then the family that was moving to the park. And here are the houses of the two nieces. Sina and Charles Kent, he worked for the tobacco company. Nancy and Edward O'Hanlon, He had his own pharmacy, O'Hanlon, and the O'Hanlon building downtown is based on that. But I don't think there'd be any mistaking the association between the people who live in that house and Reynolda House, because, and they're both designed by Charles Barton Keene. There's 9 examples of Georgian Revival architecture in Reynolda Park. And these are more formal, symmetrical, 2-story, impressive entrances. And this is the house for the Whitakers. That's a wooden Georgian Revival. The house that was remodeled for Mamie Gray and Alexander Galloway, and there's a famous story, do you know it? Where they were robbed and decided that it was just too dangerous to live in the country, so they moved back down to Cherry Street. And then Myrtle Chatham and Madison Motzinger moved there, and they lived there a very, very long period of time. I feel like I need to mention that when they were remodeling this house and enlarging it was when Bowman Gray, Mamie's brother, was building Grayland. So that would be another sibling connection. Other siblings, George Cohen and May Cohen, and houses that have a Palladian presence to them. And then May Barber and William Poindexter Hill, next door neighbors, with variations on Georgian Revival houses. The house built for F.L. Owen, who was the traffic manager, with the designs by Northrop and O'Brien and the gardens by Thomas Sears. Emery Barber and Norman Stockton, what I think of as a fully loaded Georgian Revival house. And then a late 30s house for Nancy Kreitz O'Hanlon and C.G. Hill, her husband, by William Roy Wallace. Most of the Keene houses in Reynolda Park were designed in association with William Roy Wallace. And I think he tends to have been the person who really brought in the correct proportions, the academic trappings to the house. Now there's 4 picturesque medieval Tudor Cotswold cottages in Reynolda Park of the original 16. And what you're looking at here is the house designed by Charles Barton Keene for lawyer Richard Stockton, catty corner across from his brother. Originally, the entrance faced Reynolda Road, and that's what's in the little inset. And originally, it was a Tudor Revival house. And it was probably red brick. When James Gray lived there, he changed the entrance. And so what we're looking at in the large image is from Kent Road, and it looks very, very different than it would have from the front. Now, this is a house that Margaret and Owen Moon lived in. I think I would have to say that they were the most distinctive couple in Reynolda Park. They were wealthy, they came from the Northeast, they were Quaker, they had a sense of social justice. Owen Moon had been the editor of a newspaper in Trenton for 27 years before he came to Winston-Salem. And in Trenton, he took on the Roeblings all the time. So when he got here, the Reynolds and the Gray families did not intimidate him. Margaret Moon came from the Scott Paper Company, which was the first to brand toilet paper tissue. Up until then, toilet paper didn't have a brand, just bought it. And Scott became the brand name, and they were the first to put it on a roll. Well, you can imagine how significant this is in terms of national branding. They also owned what was America's largest stock farm in Vermont. So the Moons were quite something when they arrived in their middle age in Reynolda Park. He came in 1925, and between 25 and 37, Owen Moon bought the Winston-Salem Journal, the Winston-Salem Sentinel. He started WSJS radio station and built the Carolina Theater. He annoyed the Winston-Salem power brokers because he really did it his way. And they bought him out for $2 million. When finally the Moons left, and after some time, R.J. Reynolds' president, Edward Darr, bought that house, and Reynolda Park sighed relief. This is Mr. Dyer's house. He actually, he was one of the farm boys I mentioned who did well through with the leaf department, and he was one of the 4 men who actually devised the formula for Camel cigarettes. But when he started to build this house, he died, and so his wife remained on Spring Street, and I don't believe that Mr. Dyer ever got to the house. It wasn't completed. But in terms of aspiration, the architects are the same architects who designed Centenary Methodist Church. And I think that that was a pretty grandiloquent gesture for him to make. The 4th house that falls into this more picturesque medieval quality is the one that was built by R.J. Reynolds Jr. and his wife Blitz with her parents, Mary Taylor and John Dillard. And if you look at the house plans, which are online from NC State, you can see that the house has 2 zones, one for a family with 3 children, soon to be 4, and then for the parents on the ground floor. The Reynolds lived with the Dillards while they were building Mary Acres and Devotion, and so there was quite a bit of house building and estate building going on during this time. I just want to mention that Blitz's grandfather, William Taylor, was a tobacco pioneer too, and his company was the one company that did not sell out to R.J. Reynolds. In other words, they continued through the 1950s. And the Taylor house down in the West End, the Red Taylor house, is her grandfather's house, and then her uncles lived all around the property. So really, the way people had lived in kin, next door to your kin, is what they moved to the suburbs when they moved out here. As if Reynolda Park needed any more cachet, having R.J. Reynolds Jr. and Blitz move there provided it. They were quite something when they were in the neighborhood. I always have loved that photograph. Okay, we're going to look at 3 more, and I'm just going to check my watch because I don't want to keep you here too late. One is the West Highlands neighborhood that Pleasant Henderson Haynes built and that I called his family enclave. And a really strange thing, he should have named it, and he didn't, because you can see it's really wordy. West Highlands, Pleasant Henderson Haynes Family Enclave, 1st Street, Runnymede, Stratford Road, Georgia Avenue. It just doesn't have the ring that Reynolda Park does, or Country Club. And when, after one of his land deals, you all probably know this, that Pleasant Henderson Haynes had been in tobacco and sold to R.J. Reynolds and then went into textiles, and that's the P.H. Haynes Knitting Company. He was known to his friends as Plez, but what I think he was really passionate about was architecture. When he made one of his deals, a friend asked him if he was trying to buy all of Forsyth County, and he replied, "No, just the land that adjoins mine." Well, you can see this is a story that has no end. And he started in the West End, across what now is Haynes Park, and just celebrated its 100th anniversary in September, and up the hill to Stratford Road. And it had been a farm and a dairy farm, and he owned the land going out to where Hanestown is. And in 1910 is when Hanestown was starting to be built. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of acreage that Pleasant Henderson Haynes owned. And can you all see, I hate to turn around and lose the microphone, but look really carefully at that aerial photograph, because in the middle to the right is the Pleasant Henderson Haynes family. And in that West Highlands neighborhood that was laid out by Lewis Miller, who had done Haynes Park, worked here briefly, and Ellerby again did the survey, the 2 large lots at the top of the hill, you're going up that hill from 1st Street, were reserved for his children. And can everybody see where it says Block 5, which is P. Huber Haynes? Can you see that? And then across 1st Street, a triangular site is where William Marvin Haynes lived. That was his land. And then that small little wedge in between there is where Ruth Haynes Craig had. And she not only had the smallest between her brothers in terms of land, but after a couple of years they cut it down so she had an even smaller site of land. It's my women's history background that makes me notice that. But what that is, what you had then were the Pleasant Henderson Haynes family, who had grown up on Cherry Street, and Plez never did leave Cherry Street. He stayed down there. They moved here, and they had a view over the whole city. They were at a high point. And then across Stratford Road, which in those days was known as Lover's Lane, you have, again, it was that high point closest to the city. You've got the John Wesley Haynes family. And so what I want you to realize is at that spot, you have 2 sets of Haynes cousins who were building these large suburban estates. And on the other side of Stratford Road, starting with Lucy Haynes, who married Thurman Chatham, Robert Haynes, who became president of Wachovia Bank. And there was one, well, I'll show you when we get to the land, one outsider, but an insider to B.S. Womble. And then the corner lot is where Fred Haynes, who was a doctor. So it was a pretty spectacular corner up there. And for the purposes of this lecture, I wish that they had given it a better name so I don't have to keep calling it the Pleasant Henderson Haynes Family Enclave. Okay, but this is going to surprise you, I think. Some of you may have seen this house. I certainly never did because it was demolished in the 1960s, and it is the site where the office buildings, the Tennessee Bank and the two major concrete buildings are there. But that is where William Marvin Haynes and his wife Nona built a spectacular house. Now, I believe this is the only building by Louis Asbury, who was a Charlotte architect in Winston-Salem. And in the newspaper, Louis Asbury said that he thought it was the second best house in the state of North Carolina. Well, of course, my ears pricked up at that because I would have thought that Reynolda would be saying that after Biltmore, or maybe Graylin, but anyway, Asbury thought that Nunn Hall, the estate of Nona Swank and William Haynes. So you can see how extensive the gardens are, which go down to where the Whole Foods shopping center is now. The house that the daughter Ruth Haynes and her husband, Dr. Craig, built is still there. It's behind a massive brick wall. And what I brought that little snapshot in because I wanted you to realize that originally those houses were right on First Street, and you just go up and you could walk up to the front door. And then on the large parcel that's bounded by Runnymede, Springdale, Stratford, and Georgia was an even larger house built for P. Huber Haynes, the son, and his wife, Evelyn. And just an idea of what the Haynes family looked like. Evelyn and P. Huber Haynes, the 4 generations of women at Rosehue, named after the 2 children, Rosalie and Huber. And then Will Haynes at his Adirondack camp. Across the street is Stratford Place. Now that does have a very catchy name to it. And that's the estate of John Wesley Haynes. P. Henderson Haynes was the older brother, and he lived till 1925. So he was really able to participate in the development of the boom years in the 1920s. John Wesley Haynes died in 1903. So he had the land. This was a farm too, but this is his estate that plans it. And you may be familiar with the plan that was laid out by Thomas Sears. And here are the 4 houses. Particularly the 2 end lots were very, very large. And the house for Lucy Haynes and Thurman Chatham, which I think all of our hearts started to beat again when it was sold several years ago, and we didn't have to worry because this really is the sentinel that starts Stratford Road. It was a starter home for Lucy. And then next door, the Robert Haynes house, Georgian Revival. And then across the street, and these lots don't go back as deep as the Chatham and the other Haynes lot. But this is a house built by Bunyan S. Womble, who was a lawyer for the Haynes family, and his wife, Ruth Willingham. And one of the things that I have, my husband does crossword puzzles to keep his mind sharp. What I try to do is keep Winston-Salem families straight. And for instance, you might not realize that Edith Willingham was married to several Willinghams, and they were then married to Freeze, and they lived on Georgia. So basically, they did not live very far away from each other. And that's just what it's a very close community. This one lot had a depressed area. It wasn't as choice a lot as the other Haynes houses, but the Palings who live there now have turned that corner of the lot into an exquisite garden. And then hidden behind the trees, this house makes me think that Dr. Fred Haynes wished that he were living in Reynolda Park, because the house is more picturesquely sited, and it's also medieval in style. So what we have with these houses at that end of Stratford Road are grand formal houses up front, frontal on to the main road. They're not tucked away, they're not screened from public view. They were on the road to the Haynes dairy and to the Haynes Knitting Company. And it's like everybody who rode by could see that's a pretty remarkable house. Oh, and the Haynes brought polo. This was a short-lived periodical in Winston-Salem that detailed polo golf social clubs. Now, Stratford Road, think about this. From Reynolda Park at one end and the Haynes complex at the other. It provides a bridge between textiles and tobacco. I think of those two neighborhoods as anchor stores, and then Reynolda Park is in between. And Stratford Road is just an amazing road for us to have, that we can ride down and look at those houses every single day. And I think we have to be enormously grateful to the people who live there. They were lined with substantial period houses, tobacco and textile executives, but not ones who came from old families, ones who came from somewhere else and moved through the ranks. Local industrialists like the Spocks and the Nissens, local merchants, Belt, Stockton, lawyers and doctors, realtors. So, in other words, there's a connection. But, okay. This is the last of the four, out to the country club. And I apologize for this, but that's the best we could get from the deeds. And the main thing for you to realize is that you have curvilinear streets, you've got smaller lots than you had in Reynolda Park, and the whole thing is focused on the golf course. Now, R.J. Reynolds' younger brother, Will, who became president of the company after his brother's death, but really only 1918 to 1924, because Bowman Gray becomes president in 24, so it's just 6 years. He owned Westview, which was a pig and dairy farm west of town, near where the new country club was started in 1913. Not a show farm like Reynolda, he was known to boast. He thought this was a little too fancy-smancy. By 1923, he had turned his attention to Tanglewood Farms out on the Yadkin and was training trotters and developing Westview into an exclusive suburban neighborhood oriented to the new country club. It started at the same time as Reynolda Park, obviously further west from the city, considerably larger in terms of acreage, with more numerous but smaller house sites. Ellerby is the person who platted the 175 lots, and most had 100 to 175 frontage, though sometimes property owners would combine lots for larger home sites. The original street names, Club Park Road, Country Club Road, Westview, reflect the geography. The families, Biddings, Liebrook, and Reynolds, are names that are still there as well. If, again, look carefully at this aerial photograph that was shot prior to 1928. It shows that the building adjacent to the golf course is slow. The lower right is where C.M. Norfleet built, and then going around you have Follen, who is married to a Kreitz niece, and then Gray, married to a Kreitz niece, and that open triangular area is where J.K. Norfleet's house is built. And there is extraordinary documentation on that house because Susan King saved it. And that house was up by 1929, so that's what makes me think the photographs before then. And way over in the trees is a 6-acre site by that Jack Lynn of the tobacco company built. The golf and tennis, Robert Follen was the #1 golfer in Winston-Salem, and his wife, Mary, who was a Kreitz, was no slouch. They were both very good. They spent the first 15 years of their marriage in the West End and then moved out here. Unfortunately, this is so sad, he died at 50 on a trip to, so he didn't really get to enjoy his suburban location. Okay, here are the houses. This is not a surprise. The two houses that the Kreitz nieces built reference Reynolda, and I've worried many, many times, why did two of the sisters move to Country Club, two moved to Reynolda Park? Did they have, one liked Catherine, one liked Uncle Will? What was it? And I've decided, I think it had to do, both of the husbands of these nieces were golfers. They were among the original founders of the Forsyth Country Club, and I think that they just chose recreation over family. And then here are two houses that have played a big part in Winston-Salem, the Corinne and Charles Norfleet house on the left, and the J.K. and Nanny Norfleet on the right. And again, as soon as the Norfleets moved there, they both died. Not that the house had anything to do with it, but it's and then two spectacular medieval houses. Jack Glenn, who built on Club Park Road, and then he built for his sister, Lena Pratt, on Pine Valley Road, and you've probably seen this house go through. I should say that not only was Jack Glenn head of the Leaf Company at R.J. Reynolds, but he also married a woman, Margaret Irwin, whose father owned the largest spinning mills in North Carolina. Okay. Okay, I'm concluding now. And what my note to myself says, the past is a foreign country. Obviously, the architectural legacy that we have is due to industrial prosperity. I mean, for a town with fewer than 80,000 people in the 1920s, Winston-Salem had a great deal of prosperity. It also has to do with the acumen of the clients who just simply hired excellent architects and landscape architects. And so starting with those estates and then through the suburban neighborhoods, there is a standard of excellence that really makes Winston-Salem stand out. I'm not going to say any more about the architect. and I have to give Jim Collins credit for the good-looking C. Gilbert Humphreys, for whom there are no photographs, but he definitely designed a number of wonderful houses in town. And more, I think the fact that Luther Lashmet was a hometown boy and came back here did a lot for Winston-Salem's built environment. And then William Roy Wallace, who had been an office boy, and actually, let me set something straight, he did not have anything to do with Reynolda. He would have been too young, but in the 20s, he came back to Winston-Salem with Charles Barton Keene, and then his son, William Roy Wallace Jr., continued. And the quality of the houses that continues from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, much of it is out of the William Roy Wallace office. That Winston-Salem has such a great cache of great country and suburban houses is, of course, due to the cash that tobacco and textiles brought to the city. It reflects a time when we were known as the town of 100 millionaires. And we looked that up. $1 million in 1925 would be worth $14 million today. So we had. The original builders could not have envisioned their legacy, a civic landscape that defines Winston-Salem. Built by families whose success in tobacco and textiles made it all possible, these houses have been preserved by a new generation of families, many of them recent to the city. We're grateful that they've taken on the challenge of restoring or maintaining a significant older home. One of the pleasures of my retirement has been the opportunity to get up close and personal with these wonderful historic period houses and to discover that every house has a story. Now, I only told you the story of the Moons. There's 89 more stories there. But I would be remiss if I did not remind you that most houses are not protected by historic preservation covenants, hence Preservation North Carolina's sponsorship of Jackson's and my book, due out in 2020. Thank you. In a black box, and to see you all here, you could have left and I wouldn't have known.
Well, I want to thank you, Peggy, for bringing such insight and humor to our built landscape here. Let's give her another round of applause. And if like a full house, that's because it is. I want to thank all of you for your patience with the admission process. We're so thrilled that you're here and that we were able to make space. We were fortunate that a partner from the University of North Carolina School of the Arts filmed the presentation, so we will be able to share that. If some of you have follow-up questions or want to take a closer look at some of those phenomenal aerial images, etc. We have a few minutes for a couple questions. I know you've been sitting a long time. The reception will be well worth it. But I'm happy to take 2 questions for Dr. Smith before we adjourn.
Do you know why the moons came to Winston-Salem?
Oh. I just want to say that I spent the month of June last year working on the moons because they were written up in, if you know what newspapers.com is, they were written up in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Florida, and what I got from that, I love Mr. Moon. He must have been very difficult to deal with. And I think at a certain point, he had worn his welcome out in Trenton, and he left in like July 1925 and was on a trip around the world. 6 months later, he was back and he bought the Winston-Salem Journal. So in other words, he couldn't stay out of the fray. The powers that be, and let me just say, they're all people whose houses we've just looked at, paid him $2 million for the newspaper and ran him out of town to a degree. And that's what, and Piedmont Publishing was what came in then after that. But most of the entries I've written are 1,000-word entries per house, and I think the moons are about 6,000. Somebody's going to have to deal with it, but he was a piece of work.
Another question?
Peggy, if you could give us an overview of what you think of the architectural quality of these houses. There seems to be a lot of variety. I wonder whether the people who hired those architects had that variety in mind?
Well, it's not, I would say that the architectural quality is extremely high. There's many more Georgian Revival, Classic Revival houses. And I used to think about that because Reynolda, of course, is informal and it's a bungalow and it's accessible and wonderful in a picturesque way, and thinking, well, then what happened? And in the 20s, it's true that there was a move toward more formal houses. If you think about the suburbs that you grew up or that you've ridden through. But the reason that these houses are worth talking about is they were designed by architects who had been trained in a Beaux-Arts method, and they understood proportion. So it isn't like saying, oh, I want a Palladian window, and just putting a Palladian window here and putting an entrance. They all fit together. There's a proportional system with the mass of the house and the windows and the entrance. Plus, they all have a uniform setback. And so that's one reason that it seems so reasonable and pleasant when you're going through, because there's not a lot of mismatching going on. So I think that Charles Barton Keene had a 20-year career in Philadelphia designing exactly in the same place, estates, suburban houses, and kept the practice going, balancing them both. And when he came down here, he had another 20-year period doing that. And I think that I've overlooked William Roy Wallace. I mean, I've grown to appreciate him, to realize that in the 20s, which were Keene's big years here, I mean, you think how many houses he designed. He was ill, and he really came out of that more arts and craft tradition, and I think that Wallace helped him with, he had designed some pretty formal Georgian Revival estates, but I think that Wallace is responsible for a lot of the work. And from 1924 to 1928, Keene and Wallace, if you've got your plans that to get Wallace to stay with him, Charles Barton Keene gave him a partnership. And then Keene came back down here independently, and he superintended the Keene houses. So, you know, what's usually considered a very major Georgian Revival house is the one built for P. Huber Haynes over on Georgia. In the AIA guide, that house is called the most beautiful house in Winston-Salem. And I have to tell you, that was Robert Meyer's opinion, and he worked on that guide, so that's probably why it says that. But that house, Wallace ended. Don't you love that? Corinne and C.M. Norfleet and Jim and Beulah Weeks welcoming you. And then that's it.
I have 3 quick related questions, Peggy. Reynolda Park, do you know who laid out the roads, East Kent and West Kent? Did Sears have a road? And what was the first house?
I should have said that. I thought I did.
Peggy, maybe?
And I don't want to end this afternoon by falling off the stage, which I want you to realize I'm perfectly capable of doing. That Sears laid out the street pattern, and so he would have the idea of the curvilinear street and the East Kent and the West Kent. One thing I love, Kent, of course, is named after Zena Kent's husband, Charles Kent. They were married very briefly because he died. And somehow he keeps in perpetuity in Reynolda Park, but it really should be called Cena Road. she became sort of the grand dame of the neighborhood. You know, she took care of everybody and lived there a long, long time. So Sears is the one who laid out the plan, and then the plan that Ellerby drew was based on Sears' plan. Is that?
Which house, the first house?
And the very first house is the house that's on the corner of Reynolda Road and Coliseum, that was built for Lola Johnston, who was Catherine Smith Reynolds Johnston's mother-in-law. And you all probably know this, but Coliseum didn't exist. So when Reynolda Park, it was a golf course suburb. It was adjacent to the golf course. And now that sort of broken up, but her house was right at the corner. And a very sweet house. It was started 2 weeks after that garden party in 1923.
Since I have the microphone, I have the privilege of the last question. Will you and Jackson return when your book is out to
Oh.
Reynolda?
Yes, for sure. The question is, will you return?